Hey, Nick.
Hey, Liam.
So there's this fly, and it's just flying around, and it notices a small creature on its back. So it says, "Hey, you're on my back. Are you an arachnid?" To which the creature replies, "I might be."
Oh.
The fly groans, and the fly says, "That is the worst pun I've ever heard." And the mite says, "Well, what do you expect? I just made it up on the fly." Hello and welcome to Entocast, and today we have a very special episode because it's our birthday.
That's right, it's been a whole year of Entocast. Are you sick of us yet? Are you sick of us?
So today we thought we'd do something a little bit special just to celebrate our first year being on the air.
Long-time listeners to the show will remember that our very, very first episode, with its terrible sound quality that grieves me to this day, we awarded different insects Oscars for having cool different categories. So we're going to go through some different categories of insects, award some new Oscars to different insects.
Yeah, so here we go. Insect Oscars round 2.
So I've tried to come up with a few more different categories and maybe slightly unexpected. So for my first one, I found what I think is the strongest insect.
Okay.
So I've found it as Onthophagus taurus. Do you know what that is?
No.
It's a type of dung beetle.
Ah, of course.
It has a very strange mating. I say it's got a very strange mating thing. All insects seem to have very strange mating. But they're not like normal dung beetles you think of that roll big balls of dung. They just collect it and drag it down holes with them.
Well, yeah, there's 3 different types of dung beetles, aren't there? You've got the ones that kind of just tunnel and burrow in the dung itself. The ones which collect a ball and move it away and bury it. And then the ones which literally just bury it underneath the dung. So it's one of these last ones, right?
Yeah, that's right. And what the males do is they try to get into the holes, but then they fight with each other as they go in. And the way they fight with each other is they have great big horns, and they interlock their horns, and they push each other. So what some scientists did is they tried to find out how hard they're actually pushing each other. So they essentially hooked a Newton meter around its horns, and then started pulling so it would push back, and found at what point it would be unable to push back. And they found, incredibly, that these guys were able to push 1,141 times its own body weight.
Wow, that's some serious pushing.
Yeah, so to put that in a little bit of context, you often think of ants as being very, very strong. They lift much times their own body weight. But most ants lift around 50 times their own body weight. So this is pushing more than 1,000 times its own body weight. So it's incredibly, incredibly strong.
Yeah, and actually, now you say it, it's not surprising because if you've ever picked up a dung beetle, you can feel them. They try and like push down between your fingers, and they are really, really strong.
Yeah, no, incredibly strong. So it just seems to be a evolutionary thing from all this fighting that the males do, because it seems that the males just compete just through this fighting, and whoever's the strongest wins. So they've just had selection pressure to make them stronger and stronger and stronger. Apart from some males, so some males in this species, they don't grow horns. And what these males do is they're smaller, and they just are quite good at hiding. So they just wait for the other males to fight it out. And while they're fighting, they sneak down the hole and they mate with the female and then leave while they're still fighting. So there are a couple of different strategies. You can either be incredibly strong or cunning in this particular species.
Oh, that's brilliant. I love these examples of the sneaky males.
Well, I just found it brilliant because there's the different strategies you can do, and I feel like I would probably be the cunning one. I don't think I'm going to win any favours by pushing someone very hard.
Down a hole.
Down a hole full of dung. another category I found that I thought was quite incredible is, you know, when you think of insects in B movies, like the movies from the 50s when nuclear war was always a big thing, they were always making these films about giant insects from radiation. So mostly radiation doesn't really do that to insects.
What?
And when I say mostly, I mean entirely.
So these aren't documentaries?
Surprisingly, no. But during this time period, in the same time period in the 50s, was where they were pioneering something called sterile insect technique. Are you familiar with that?
Yeah, this is where they are rearing males which are sterile to then release and then help control a pest population, right?
Yeah, exactly. And in the 50s, they were just getting into nuclear power, and that was starting to be a thing. And they were thinking, what other uses could this have? And one of the uses they found was it was able to sterilize things. So they thought they could use it to sterilize insects.
And that's because radiation's really good at killing sperm.
Yeah, radiation is really good at damaging cells, and it damages cells that are the most quickly growing and reproducing. So that's why it affects particularly sexual cells, because they're being produced all the time. So I found a paper from the 50s where they were trying to see if they could use a sterile insect technique on a parasitic wasp of the Buconidae. It's called Haberbrachen hibetor. They found that they were able to indeed sterilize it, but they decided to be like, well, what will happen if we just crank up this radiation? They found the dose that sterilizes it, but they're like, well, we've still got all this spare radiation. What are we going to do with it? So they tried to find the lethal dose for this wasp, and they found that it survived up to 158,000 rads. And to put that in context, the lethal dose for humans is 1,000. In terms of other insects, in Drosophila melanogaster, it's around 56,000. So it's about 3 times as radiation resistant as Drosophila.
So was it just this one insect they did it to, or have we got these kind of measurements for several insects?
We've got it for a lot of insects. I mean, the famous one is always cockroaches. People always like cockroaches will always survive a nuclear war. But that is demonstrably not true. So cockroaches can survive around 9,000 rads. So it's not even as good as Drosophila. It's better than humans, but we're kind of at it, so it's not especially great. But I did find that this wasp seems to be the 4th most tolerant organism, not even animal, organism at all, of radiation. So it's pretty impressive. It was only beaten by an archaea called Thermococcus gamma tolerans, a very inventive name there. Sounds like something out of The Incredible Hulk. There's also a bacteria that it was beaten by called Deinococcus radiodurans, again, very inventive. And of course, what do you think of as the most tolerant animal species ever, of everything?
Animal, maybe a tardigrade?
Yeah, tardigrade is the only other thing that beat it. So Thermococcus gamma tolerans, the archaea, is the most radiation tolerant, and it can tolerate up to 300,000 rads. The bacteria can tolerate around 300,000, and tardigrades can tolerate around 250,000. So wow. They're all incredibly tolerant, but this Buconidae as well seems to be very radiation tolerant. Some people do question it though, because it's only really been documented in this one study, and there haven't been any repeats of it, because it's, in all honesty, a bit of a spurious experiment. So there's been no repeats of it. So some people do question whether it would actually be repeatable. But in this experiment in the 50s, they showed that it was tolerant up to 150,000 rads. So pretty impressive.
And there you go. There's a new experiment for your PhD. You can repeat on this wasp, and then you can also run it for your Osmia and your Califera.
Yeah, I'll just need to get a hold of some plutonium. So, you know, I'm sure in 1985 that is available at every corner shop. So by 2018, then it should be available too. Oh, that was a pained reference to Back to the Future.
Yeah, I was with you.
And for the last cool category I found what I think is called the hardest insect. And it's not an insect that is going up, beating up other insects down the pub. This is physically the most durable and hard, and you cannot puncture the exoskeleton. So to put this in context, when there are collectors of insects and they pin these insects, they have to use a drill to pin it because they cannot pierce through the exoskeleton.
Wow.
So this is a subfamily called the Zophinorinae, and they're called ironclad beetles.
Good name.
Yeah, well, it's very descriptive. So these are beetles that live in the desert around Texas and Mexico, and because deserts are dry, they have evolved this hard shell to survive desiccation. So essentially, their method of not drying up is to make their exoskeleton so hard and so thick that no water can escape from it. But this also has the side effect that it makes it really, really, really hard as well. So if you stepped on them, they would not squish at all. They would play dead, and then when you walked away, they'll just walk off completely unharmed. Like I said, they can play dead, which is their method to avoid attracting attention. So they're normally quite well camouflaged. Some of them look like bird poo, or some of them just look like grey rocks and stuff like that. So they're quite well camouflaged. And if there's any activity around them, they'll just play dead and nothing will see them. And even if they did see them, I'm not even sure they'll be able to pierce them. But because of this, it has an unfortunate consequence for them, which means that in Mexico, jewelers actually find these insects and they decorate them and they sell them as living jewelry. So people wear them, and because they're playing dead all the time that you're wearing it because you're a big scary human, they just look like jewelry, and they're decorated with various little golds and jewels and things.
But they're still alive.
Yeah, I don't think I can really condone this, but I think the last laugh will be on the beetle, because I imagine as soon as you take it off and you leave, it'll just walk away. So all your jewelry will just walk away. So I'm hoping that's what happens with these beetles, because it sounds a little bit cruel.
Yeah, a bit sad, really.
Yeah.
So what is it that's actually making them so hard? Is it just the way they're structuring the chitin in the exoskeleton, or that it's really thick, or have they incorporated other types of molecules, or do we not know?
I looked into this, and you're partly right. Yes, part of it is the structure of it. So they have basically a very branched structure that goes in many different directions, and by going in many different directions, it basically makes it so they're not able to move past each other, the molecules, which makes it very hard. It's also very, very thick, and they embed different minerals into the actual structure. So they have like various calcium carbonates and things. So essentially part of their exoskeleton is rock, and then it's got this branching structure as well. And this has been studied by the military, and they've used it to design very, very durable tanks. And they've actually made a titanium alloy which is like the shell, and it's a memory metal. So that means that when it bends, it just goes back into place. So they've made a tank using the structure of this insect exoskeleton, that when it's hit by a bomb blast, it'll just bend and then it'll go back into place, which I find really cool.
Wow, that is seriously cool. I love these examples of where, like, we look at insects and what they're doing in nature, and then kind of inspired and can learn from them.
Yeah, no, definitely. And this seems like a really good example of biomimicry, as it's called, which is study of animals to find how they do things and see if we can apply them. And yeah, I can obviously see that there are military applications of such a hard exoskeleton.
I mean, this one's so cool. I think it's my new favourite example.
Yeah, it is pretty cool. And also, they have some pretty awesome names as well. So there's one that's called the Diabolical Ironclad Beetle.
Wow, amazing.
Which is cool. And it's called that because it's just black, and it looks pretty evil, to be honest. It looks like it's got a plan.
some pretty cool insectopsids. So I also have a category. Now, I have just one category that I've been thinking about. Something that we've kind of touched on throughout the whole of our podcast because just of the nature of the category itself. So I've been thinking a little bit about the insects which have most influenced humans, or another way to put it, insects which changed the world.
Ooh, that's a good category. I think I can forgive you for only having one.
So yeah, it's a little bit of a anthropocentric category in terms of the insects which have affected us, because at the end of the day, they're just doing what they do. And most of these, as you'll see, the only reason they have any kind of impact on humans whatsoever is just because of like a chance byproduct or just a coincidence. So yeah, before I go on to the first one, I'd just like to kind of put a disclaimer out there. A lot of this is really kind of abstract and it's down to personal opinion, and there's no kind of real way to quantify the impacts because they're impacted us in different ways. But we can go through and talk about some of the history and the reasons why they're so important. So, first off, I'm going to kind of I've got a few honourable mentions before I go for my winner. So I'm going to start off with body lice.
Body lice.
Body lice.
That sounds like a great and noble impact on humanity. Please convince me.
Yeah, so not all of these impacts are good. So body lice, anyone who's read about, they're not doing so well nowadays compared to how they were in the past. I think it's to do with general kind of hygiene and inventions that go along with that. So one invention, for example, which has done it for lice is the iron, electric irons, which are really easy. So people are ironing their clothes a lot, and that can kill any lice in the clothing. Also, the washing machines become much more widespread, much hotter temperatures. I think the washing machine is a real major driver of less body lice nowadays. But before we had these kind of modern comforts, body lice were much more constant. And if you look into famous literature of the past, many of these pieces do refer to body lice as these kind of little nuisance companions that they have. And in particular, you read about World War One and life in the trenches, and the lice are a major component of the day-to-day life of the soldiers in the trenches in these terrible conditions. And it's quite interesting. And the reason they're onto my list is because there's actually recent DNA evidence which indicated that Napoleon's army, when he tried to conquer Moscow, one of the reasons why they failed was because of lice. And the way this works is that they were severely weakened by typhus.
And is this spread by the lice? Yeah.
The persistent lice infestation in the army, they think, was actually spreading the typhus, which is pretty cool.
That is really cool. So you saying if it hadn't been for lice, Napoleon would have conquered Russia?
I mean, the winter was a pretty major factor too, but who knows? Maybe there would have been over this crucial threshold of soldiers who were fit and healthy to fight. And if he had conquered Moscow, then the whole of European history would have been pretty different, I reckon. Yeah,
would we all be speaking French now?
Possibly, and we'd definitely be using metric. So, next category for insects which have influenced humans or changed the world. So the next one is Dactylopius coccus.
What's that?
This is the cochineal bug.
A cochineal bug. Go on.
So it's a bug which is native to South America and Mexico, Central and South America, and it feeds on a cactus.
Okay. I'm not seeing how it's affecting humanity so far, but I'll humour you. Go on.
Well, it has a crimson pigment which we use to create cochineal dye. So before the advent of modern dyes, if we ever wanted to colour a material, we had to rely on natural products. And cochineal was a major colour project for people who wanted to have stuff that was crimson or red kind of thing. So very important. It was actually used by the native Central Americans for many years first, but then came to Europe and the rest of the world in a really big way.
I mean, it's nice to have red, but how has that impacted humanity in such a way?
The ability to have colours social culturally is actually quite significant. I mean, you look back at history and the creation and use of dyes has always been there. It's always been recorded in history. Because without that, everything is kind of, all of our products, you know, I'm thinking like clothes and materials and textiles, they're very limited in the natural colours they'd be. It's kind of a scale from white to kind of beige to brown. So this is something which historically, dyeing of clothes has always been a significant economic factor in most cultures.
Yeah, wasn't the guy who discovered how to make purple dye, so William Henry Perkin, didn't he become a massive philanthropist and sort of a patron of science? So he was trying to find a cure for malaria. He was trying to synthetically produce quinine, and he ended up producing a purple dye, which wasn't what he was looking for, but it made him fabulously wealthy.
So yeah, who'd have thought it really? Some little soft-bodied true bug that sits stuck in a cactus could become so important just because of this colour. So on to the next category, one of our favourites, something we've talked about a lot already, and that is the honeybee. The impact of this insect is perhaps a little bit more obvious. We are quite familiar with honey, that's something we get from. So the honeybee was originally from Africa and Asia. It's quite interesting looking to see where it's being traced back to and how it's spread. But in terms of domestication, it's been domesticated for thousands of years. There's evidence of the ancient Egyptians keeping honeybees, and across ancient Central and the Near East and Central Asia. And then it made its way across Europe, and eventually when the Europeans went to North America, took it with them, and it's now all over the entire world. And it's mostly one species, Apis mellifera, but there are also a couple of other species of Apis which are kept. And the primary reason we keep honeybees is for the production of honey. And there's lots of different hives and ways of doing this. But there's also other products that we can get from honeybees. Notably is the wax. And actually in the Middle Ages in Europe, especially in England, the honeybee wax was seen as very, very valuable because it was used in the churches and cathedrals for the candles. And this is because the other alternative is tallow candles made from animal fat and the like, which burns with the smoke. However, the beeswax candles doesn't smoke very much and has a more consistent, bright flame. So absolutely perfect for using indoors. You're not going to make, especially in a cathedral, something where there could be artwork or kind of expensive decoration, stained glass windows. The last thing you want is a layer of soot all over that from the many, many candles which people light in church as part of the worshipping and celebrations. It's also helped very much with literacy by having a candle which burns brightly and without producing too much smoke. It helps with reading, particularly back in those days. The only people who were literate were mostly the monks. So it helped with the production and dissemination of written literature.
Wow. So is this why that you see so many different, a lot of monasteries I've been to, they all seem to keep bees? Is that why they keep bees? Or is that just a fun thing to do?
Yes. Yeah, I think there's actually is a strong correlation here between... So one is the monks, they actually had time to look after the bees properly. And two, a major reason for many abbeys and monasteries and cathedrals having their own bees is a source of beeswax for the candles.
Wow. And you say that's associated with the spread of literacy and... Wow.
Yeah. And what we must remember as well is before sugar came, when the Europeans were exploring the world and found and developed the sugar cane, we had no sweetener. So honey was incredibly important as one of our only sources of sweetness. You think about how much things sugar's put into nowadays. Before we had sugar cane, we were relying on parsnips and honey. So There, in terms of the products that they've given us, there's no argument that honeybees have changed human history. We also must not forget a massive service that bees do to us, and keeping honeybees, you are increasing the amount of bees in the landscape. Might be competing with native bees, but at the end of the day, you can't deny that honeybees are major pollinators too. So there's obviously a massive effect for agriculture across the world where honeybees are kept. And nowadays, especially in certain places such as agricultural landscapes in North America, honeybees are kept primarily not for the products they produce, but for the pollination services that they can provide to crops that need them. Okay, so I think I should probably move on to my next nomination. It is the silkworm, Bombyx mori. So the silkworm obviously is where we get silk. The story goes that it was originally discovered by a Chinese princess. So she was sat in the garden underneath a mulberry tree, and one of the pupa of these, or the larva, which was spinning a cocoon, fell out of the tree and into her cup of tea. And then from this cup of tea, she pulled out this long strand of a very strong material, and that was the silk. And that kind of inspired the development of silk production. So what is silk? The larval spins this silken cocoon and then collected and then dropped into boiling water, which unravels it. And then they can then take these long strands and kind of weave it into silk fabric. Now, silk is very valued for its properties. It's quite light, it's quite strong. Quite interesting, actually, the Mongol Empire, the warriors, when they invaded China, they had access to silk, and they'd actually wear this underneath their normal armor because it was very good at catching arrows and stopping the arrows from going into their flesh, because it would kind of catch them and tie them up as it went in, so it would protect them. So like another layer of armor, which was quite cool. And the reason the silkworm is so high on my list is because at the time when silk was discovered and developed, it was quite a unique product that was very, very highly sought after, and that led to the development and the establishment of the Silk Road, which is a very, very famous trade route that went across Asia into Europe. And this huge, huge economy was built up and established all around the production of silk, which all entirely relies on just this single species of moth.
Yeah, no, it's incredible the wealth that China generated from this. I mean, it was so enviable and so powerful because of this that didn't some guys go into China and steal the silkworm so that we could produce it outside of China?
Yeah. There's all these fantastic stories around how envious the world was of the silk and trying to learn the secrets of silk production.
You could argue that the Silk Road was transformative for all of human culture because of the things that were passed down there. It wasn't just goods, it was also knowledge and language. And so you can lay at its feet advances in science and technology because people were communicating and trading along this route. Yeah,
I think also when gunpowder was discovered and developed and spread to the world, the fact that the Silk Road had existed also changed the way that spread, which obviously as a single product also massively transformed the world.
No, definitely. I mean, yeah, I think that insect has definitely had a demonstrable impact on the world.
So that just leads me on to my winner. So you're probably thinking to yourself, how could an insect possibly have had more impact on the world than the silkworm and the Silk Road?
I am thinking exactly that.
This one is, I'm pretty sure we would argue, has had a bigger impact, but not in a good way, like the silkworm, in a bad way.
Oh.
So you might even know what's coming already, but my winner for the insect which has most changed the world is the mosquito, particularly of the genus Anopheles.
Ah, I see. Because of the spread of diseases, I'm guessing?
Exactly. Now, before we go any further, I'm desperate to say, and this caveat is dedicated to Erica, as we said in the last episode, the mosquito is an innocent vector. Like, they're not doing anything deliberately Maleficent, they are just being hijacked by a nasty, nasty little plasmodium. But nevertheless, they are a vector of malaria, which is probably the biggest disease in the world in terms of deaths and people who are at risk of infection. So I have a couple of stats from the World Health Organization. So just so we can get a sense of the scale of this disease. So nearly half the world's population are at risk from malaria.
Wow. Half? What?
Nearly half the world's population are at risk. So that means they're living in parts of the world where there is malaria.
That's crazy.
So this is to do with the distribution of where people live in, but we think about the countries which have the highest populations and the highest density. They do fall within this kind of tropical area where you have malaria, and that's because that's also where we have the mosquitoes. Another stat is in 2015 there were around 212 million malaria cases.
212 million?
Yeah, that's people who've contracted the disease. And then it's estimated, because we don't know as well, because it's such big numbers, we don't know exactly, but it's an estimated that, over 400,000 people died from malaria in a single year.
Oof, that's a lot.
Another bit of evidence that these numbers are so high is in certain parts of Africa, there's mutations which make people more resistant to malaria, but it also makes them more susceptible to having sickle cell anemia, which is obviously a bad disease as well. But because malaria is such a strong selection force, that has become kind of fixed in the population.
No, that's crazy.
So yeah, just because of purely the numbers are so big, and this is a disease which has been with us since the dawn of humanity, really, that you think about the billions of people who have died from malaria, all of which have been vectored by the Anopheles mosquito.
I guess so. And I guess it's not only just the people who died, it's also all the people who were ill from malaria. That's going to have big impacts on the economies of where they work, and what could have been lost because of this this innocent vector. There's some pretty incredible categories you've got there. They all have had a demonstrable impact on humanity. It's hard to think of a world we'd live in without some of them. Maybe without malaria, that might be nice. But it's hard to think about how the world would have been without these species and how things would have been different. Like, would we all be French now? Would the silk trade have ever existed? There's all sorts of things.
Exactly. And, these are just examples of where we can tie it down to a specific insect or a specific group of insects. But think about all the insects which are out there performing functions in the ecosystem just to provide habitat where we can live. We know how complex ecosystems are and how all insects are huge major drivers of these systems. So this list is by no means the only insects which are relevant to humans. There's so many that I'd like to just, give a nod to all the unmentioned ones.
Yeah, no, I'm thinking especially like nutrient cyclers and things like that give us all the fertile lands that we use so readily. There's so many different insects, and they're all integral in the ecosystems that we live in. So, yeah, we need these guys.
As E.O. Wilson said, the little things which run the world.
So I hope you guys have enjoyed Insect Oscars Round 2 for our birthday.
And I hope you've enjoyed the past year as much as we have.
Yep, there's more to come, many more. All that's left for us to say is to thank the Royal Entomological Society for their kind sponsorship of this show, and to thank you all for listening.
As always, you can contact us at entocast.gmail.com, and you can find all of our stuff on the website entocast.com. And here's to another year of Entocast.
Yeah, many more years to come. Thank you for listening. Goodbye.
Bye. In 2017, a pair of students decided to start a podcast about insects. These students promptly escaped from the office to the recording studio. Today, they continue to avoid their real work and survive by making podcasts. If you have a question about bees, if no one else knows the answer, if you can contact us, maybe you can ask the bee team.
I've been pretty much an entomologist ever since I can remember. So, although to tell the truth, my first biological memory is not of an insect. It is of the blue whale skeleton in the Natural History Museum when I was about 3. But leaving that embarrassing story aside.
So it's wonderful and a beautiful place to work in the Arctic, but the one thing I didn't like was the fact that there's always the sort of worry that there's polar bears around. So we had to be trained in how to use a rifle before we went out into the field, and it was just some bloody historic World War II bloody massive elephant gun thing that we were given. So we had to lug this around everywhere we went, and they said, look, I know it's a pain, but you've got to have it with you because bears are around. But when you get engrossed in your work, you sort of lose track of where all your kit is. So anyway, Roger and I were crawling around looking for these collembola, and eventually, you know, I suddenly heard this sort of noise, and I was thinking, oh my god, where's the gun? Where's the gun? But it was a reindeer just come and started grazing the lichen right by my face.
They're the zombie ants and the fungus which takes over them. And it's a kind of a similar thing where an ant's just going along its daily business, nice and happy, and then, you know, accidentally ingest some spores from this fungus, you know, not really know much about it. And then all of a sudden it starts to behave a bit weird. And then we're not exactly sure how it does this, but what it basically does is it makes the ant start to behave as if it was drunk. So it's kind of staggering around all over the place, moving around, and sometimes some ants have evolved social immunity. So as soon as they spot a member of their colony doing something a little bit weird, they're like, hang on a second, Barry, are you infected? Are you infected? And they'll take them outside, and
This genuinely sounds like what happens when your friend does too many drinks. Like, Barry, are you okay? Well, let's get you outside, away from everyone else, Barry.
Yeah, but when it's your friend who's had too many drinks, you're doing it for a nice reason. These ants are doing it for horrible. They're like, you're infected, we don't want to be infected, you're out, you're going to go die outside alone.
Right,
now.
I see. That's a little bit more grim.
So what's been the favourite thing that you've seen here at the Insect Festival today?
Pictures of books.
The pictures. Was there any in particular that were your favourite, or were they all really good?
Oh, really good.
Yeah. And do you have a favourite insect?
Yeah,
What is it?
a tick.
A tick? Wow. I wasn't expecting that. So what is it that you like about ticks?
That they're creepy.
But I found a study by a guy called Michael Smith, who was very sort of dismissive of Schmidt's pain index, and he said it was a kind of rubbish. So he made his own paper where he got stung himself, because apparently that's what you do when you're an entomologist who looks at venom. He was looking at honeybee stings, and he looked at how the pain index differs based on body location. Like I say, it is entirely on himself, and the locations tested included the nipple, the penis shaft, and the scrotum. And he tested 25 locations across the body using the internal standard of his forearm. And he did all this for science.
I'll get out a couple of drawers that I always like getting out. And the first thing I always go for is a drawer of the beetles because I'm a coleopterist at heart. And I always go for this drawer, which is a drawer of lots of shiny leaf beetles, Chrysomelidae. And the reason I go for this drawer is because there's some significance to the RHS in here and RHS's past research. And as part of our work, we provide advice to our members. And over the years, sometimes these members send in something that is new to the country. And so in this drawer, we have a good example of that. We have in one corner the lily beetle. Some of these specimens, which I know have gone a bit orange, they've lost their red colour over the years. They are from some of the first infestations in the UK, parts of Surrey, and so important specimens that way. But moving on, we've got things like the rosemary beetle here in the centre of the drawer. This feeds on rosemary, lavender and thyme, and was first found in the UK in the mid-90s. Has since spread throughout the country. Doesn't cause that much damage, to be honest, to its host plants. But again, another non-native species found in the UK as part of the advisory service here.
Well, the honeybee is highly commercialised already. Like, if I wanted to try and commercialise the honeybee, I'm 9,000 years too late.
I think that meeting people at various conferences and taking the opportunities to get involved with research around the world has just been fantastic. And I think the entomology community is just such a warm and welcoming community. And I think as well that most research now involves big collaborations, and not one of us has all the skills necessary to do every aspect of the project. We've got really massive questions that we need to be addressing, and we need big teams and lots of ideas to do that.